Fantastic. Well, thank you, everybody. This is a great turnout for our Raleigh Astronomy Club virtual meeting tonight, the 24th of July. And we have got a really great set of speakers for us tonight. Mike Leinbach and Jonathan Ward will be talking about Bringing Home Columbia, a book that they have written. I am actually in the process of reading that book, and I have to say it is phenomenal. So yeah, definitely. We'll go ahead and do that. Afterwards, we'll probably just take a quick pause, and then we'll get into our business meeting. We'll have the agenda as listed here. The treasurer will provide a brief update, a little bit of social media update as well. Alcor, which is the basically the Astronomy League coordinator, will provide us a brief view of some of the programs going on. We'll get another update from our committee. We'll talk about some open positions, and we'll do a plug for our upcoming next talk. So before we jump to our speakers tonight, we have had just a phenomenal inpouring of some new members. So I do want to welcome everybody who is either a new member or a guest. We're very pleased to have you with us this evening. So thank you for joining. So for tonight's talk, I don't know how many folks remember this, but back in February in 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated on re-entry before our very eyes, and all 7 astronauts on board were lost. Over the next 3 months, hundreds of federal, state, and local agencies combed every square foot of a 250-mile long by 10-mile debris field through the piney woods of East Texas, searching for the crew and every piece of the shuttle that they could find. This actually became the largest land search and recovery operation in U.S. history. And it even still gives me, I remember watching on TV, and it still gives me goosebumps. Our speakers tonight, Mike Leinbach. He was the final Shuttle Launch Director at NASA's JFK Space Center in Florida. He was responsible for overall shuttle launch countdown policy, planning, and execution activities. Immediately following the Columbia accident in February of 2003, Leinbach led the initial debris recovery effort in Texas and Louisiana. Shortly thereafter, he was named to lead the Columbia Reconstruction Team, chartered to determine the cause of the accident based solely on the debris collected and reassembled at KSC. He was also the driving force behind the Columbia Preservation Team and the development of the plan to lend debris to academia for study with the goal of developing better and safer spacecraft in the future. In November of 2004, Leinbach was awarded the prestigious 2004 Presidential Rank Award. He's received numerous group achievement and performance awards, including NASA's Exceptional Service Medal in 1993 for his leadership in planning and conducting shuttle launch countdowns, and NASA's Medal for Outstanding Leadership in May 2003 for significant contributions to the Space Shuttle program. Mike retired from NASA in 2011. Our other speaker tonight is Jonathan Ward. He is a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society and author of Manned Spaceflight Histories. An avid amateur astronomer, in 2019 he became the first person east of the Mississippi River to image all 110 Messier objects in a single night. He currently serves as president of the Greensboro Astronomy Club and is a NASA JPL Solar System Ambassador. So thank you and welcome very much, Jonathan and Mike.
All right, welcome everybody. Mike, are you still on?
Yeah, I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Okay. All right. Well, welcome to everybody for Mike and me. We're going to be talking with you this evening about Bringing Columbia Home, which was the story of the Columbia aftermath of the Columbia accident that as you heard about Mike's role in that, we'll be glad to talk through that with you. And we'll be stopping for questions every few minutes. If you do have questions, type them into the chat box, and they'll be summarized and presented through with us. So we have a lot of pictures, and there's some bullet points which may be hard to read if you're looking at it on your phone, but we'll talk through everything on here, and we'll be glad to answer any questions that you have along the way. Mike, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Well, folks, it's my pleasure to be with you tonight. Jonathan and I have done this presentation a few times in the past, but we haven't done it since we were both in Greenville, North Carolina, about 18 months or so ago, for a series of presentations. So we may be a bit rusty, but we'll get through this. As said, I was the launch director, so I got to know the astronauts real well. This was personally pretty devastating for not just me, but for everyone that worked on the Space Shuttle program. And indeed, it led to the termination of the shuttle program that we'll talk a little bit about later. Jonathan mentioned we love answering questions, so please submit the questions as we go, and we'll get to them. And we'd like to know what's on your mind so we can scratch your itch and not just do a presentation. So please ask us questions via the web. On page 2, I'll give you a quick summary of the accident and the aftermath. Our launch day was January 16th, 2003. It was a beautiful morning here in Florida. Crew of 7 on board the shuttle, which was typical. A piece of insulating foam broke off the external fuel tank 81 seconds into ascent, and it hit the leading edge of the orbiter. The foam, if you've ever used foam that comes in those spray cans to fill in cracks around pipes or whatever, and it comes out kind of gooey and then hardens into an open cell polyurethane foam, that product that you buy off the shelf in a hardware store is very similar to the foam that we used on the outside of the external tank. Our foam is a little fancier, but nevertheless it's the same concept, and a good insulator, very lightweight, but a fairly large piece of that broke off and hit the wing of the orbiter and damaged the orbiter. We debated the extent of the damage during the whole mission. We had we had one camera on the ground that wasn't working that day. We had another camera that was out of focus, and so the best view of the damage that you'll see coming up in 2 or 3 slides, we looked at hundreds, maybe thousands of times, but it was not conclusive as to the type or extent of the damage. And we concluded, obviously incorrectly, that it was no risk to the crew of the orbiter, and we cleared them for entry on February 1st. They were due to land back here at the Kennedy Space Center, but as the orbiter entered the upper atmosphere, there was a breach of some sort in the thermal protection system on the left wing that the foam created, and the hot plasma gas it's actually burning oxygen molecules when the orbiter comes in, or any spacecraft comes in through the atmosphere. It compresses the atmosphere so quickly and so completely that it actually burns. It spontaneously combusts the oxygen molecules in the atmosphere. So plasma gas is actually burning oxygen molecules. That got into the left wing of Columbia as she was entering over the coast of California. The failure actually occurred when that gas got in the wing, and Columbia's left wing melted from the inside out, and the wing came off, and then due to aerodynamic forces, it disintegrated and rained down over an area of 250 by 20 miles in East Texas. It didn't hurt anybody on the ground during the accident. Page 3. We did lose 2 searchers in a helicopter accident during the recovery operations. We walked a large area, but then outside of the area that we walked, we searched with helicopters. And one day we had a failure in a helicopter, and it went down. It killed 2 of the 4 people on board the helicopter. You'll see their picture coming up here shortly, too. As Mike said, it turned into the largest ground search in American history over 3 months. We ended up finding 38% of the space shuttle by weight. We returned that here to the Kennedy Space Center. All told, there were well over 100 federal, state, and local agencies, actually over 140. participating in the recovery of the debris of the spaceship and our astronauts themselves. And you know, we never did a count of how many people helped us. That would have just been impossible. But we estimated about 25,000 people helped us find all the debris over 3 months. It was returned back here to the Kennedy Space Center for reconstruction, although the word reconstruction is a bit overdone. Most of the debris that we found was smaller than your cell phone. But the National Transportation Safety Board told us, NASA folks, to create 2 teams, one a reconstruction team and one a data team. I was asked to lead the reconstruction team, and our goal was to figure out what happened to the space shuttle by looking only at the debris, no data, no pictures, no nothing, just the debris. And then there was a data team led by a flight director out of the Johnson Space Center, a buddy of mine. And per NTSB's guidance, if both those teams came up with the cause of the accident independently, the data team then, of course, looked at all the telemetry coming down from the ship, all the photos that we had and that the public sent in, any kind of data that could help us with the study. And if those 2 teams concluded the same thing, well, then you got it knocked, and indeed we did, and it was the foam on the wing, and just like you heard. All the debris is preserved here at the Kennedy Space Center. And we'll get into a little bit later. We'll get into a discussion about what we're doing with Columbia that's different than what we did with Challenger that we lost in 1986. You may recall. It did lead to the termination of the shuttle program in favor of safer spacecraft. The independent review board that studied the accident. Columbia Accident Investigation Board, led by Admiral Hal Gaiman, who also did the USS Cole investigation, concluded that the shuttle was inherently unsafe, his words, because during the first stage of ascent, when the solid rocket boosters are igniting or burning, there's no way for the astronauts to get off of the shuttle, which is true. And so they declared that inherently unsafe, and they came out with 3 major recommendations. One was to finish the International Space Station, which we did in 2011, retire the shuttle right after International Space Station was completed. And then while we were doing those 2 things, flying out the shuttle and finishing the station, develop America's Next Manned Launch System, which we were in the process of doing. So the ISS was completed and the shuttle retired in 2011.
Getting on to we'll go on to the mission now. This was STS-107 was the official flight number of the mission, even though it was the 113th mission to fly. There was a crew of 7, as Mike mentioned, and the commander is Rick Husband, who's lying down or floating horizontally in this picture. This was a picture taken aboard the Space Hab module. They were carrying a double Space Hab experimental module in the cargo bay of Columbia. It was connected by an airlock and a long tunnel to the main part of the orbiter, and they divided into a red team and a blue team. They were doing research and medical and scientific studies 24 hours a day. So we have Rick Husband lying down. Starting from the left, we have Mike Anderson, who was an astrophysicist. This was his 2nd flight. Willie McCool is the next gentleman in. He was a rookie. He was the pilot for Columbia. Dave Brown is next to him, who is a flight surgeon. This was also his first flight in space. Next to Dave is Ilan Ramon, who was Israel's first astronaut. And so there's a lot of attention on this mission because we had an Israeli astronaut who was flying on board the mission. Laurel Clark is down to the right of Ilan Ramon. This was her first mission. She was also a flight surgeon. And then Kalpana Chawla from India, an Indian-American woman, was flying her 2nd space flight as an engineer as well. So here's a view of, Mike mentioned the view of the foam coming off the wing. You can see there's a piece of something coming off from this strut that holds the nose of the orbiter to the external fuel tank, and you can see it hit the wing and then disintegrate. It was unclear whether it had hit on, the front end of the wing or just under the wing. That was one of the views. And here's the other view that through enhancements, you're able to see it. Again, it's coming off of this area here and coming down here and hitting somewhere along this area of the wing. The foam, as Mike mentioned, was about the size of a briefcase, very lightweight. It only weighed a couple of pounds at most. The one thing with the orbiter accelerating and the foam coming off, the foam actually was slowing down as soon as it got into the airstream. And with it slowing down and the orbiter moving forward, the orbiter actually impacted the foam at about 500 miles an hour on the wing. So that's why something that was so lightweight could cause damage to the orbiter.
And these videos are the ones that we looked at hundreds of times trying to figure out the damage to the vehicle, and FBI, we got the FBI involved in their photo enhancement groups, and that's as good as we could do, and here again concluded that there was probably damage. It was probably going to be a maintenance issue only on the ground, and it was no issue, no safety of flight issue for the astronauts.
One thing to note as well is when the payload bays of the space shuttle were open, the area of the wing that was hit was blocked from the view inside the cockpit, was blocked by the payload bay doors. So the astronauts could not see that part of the wing either, and there was no provision for them to be able to take a spacewalk, and they did not have a robotic arm with a TV camera on that mission because it wasn't considered necessary for that mission. So there was no way for the astronauts to be able to inspect the damage on orbit. So after 16 days, Columbia was going to come home. They were cleared to land at Kennedy Space Center, and they performed their deorbit burn out over the Indian Ocean near Australia an hour before they were due to come home. And so they crossed, the land track crossed over California coast, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and near Dallas, they lost communication with the vehicle. Sometimes there's some dropouts, but at this point, at just after 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock in the morning Dallas time, 9 o'clock in the morning Kennedy Space Center time, the communication with the crew was lost. And meanwhile, we have the families of the astronauts and Mike and the administrator of NASA waiting here. As you see, this is at the shuttle landing facility, waiting for Columbia to come home. And you can see this countdown clock here. It says 10 minutes and 18 seconds till Columbia was due to land. And what they didn't know when this picture was taken was Columbia was already lost. We did not have communication with the vehicle, and so it was not sure what was going on. Mike, you were standing there at the runway. What was going on for you that morning?
Yeah, landing day in the shuttle program was always a great day. It was a day of celebration. The mission was over. The astronauts were coming home. The atmosphere is very jovial. We had very little to do here at the Kennedy Space Center other than watch it land. It's under control by the mission flight director out of the Johnson Space Center until touchdown, and so I had no personal responsibilities on landing, and so I was an observer. I got to greet the crew after they got off the orbiter, and here again it was just a day of celebration, and when that clock that you see in this picture got down to 0, Columbia should have been on the runway right behind that trailer, and it just wasn't there, and we knew we had lost communications with the spaceship because of the feed we were getting from the Johnson Space Center. We could hear them trying to raise the crew with no response, and so we knew there was something wrong. And then when that clock ticked down to 0 and the space shuttle wasn't there and it should have been sitting on the runway, then the realization that the worst had happened really started to sink home.
So we have a few questions that I think are probably related to the foam strike.
Sure.
I can answer them. So the first one was there a chance that the piece of foam could have accelerated to a speed that could have instantly blown the wing off?
Not the size of the foam that hit us, no. obviously did some damage that we weren't expecting. We had gotten hits from foam coming off the tank on many previous missions, and therein lies an issue too that we can talk about. It we became complacent about foam hitting the orbiter. Tiny pieces of foam, not as big as the piece that doomed Columbia, but it almost became accepted that we were going to get foam loss. And so when we saw the damage, when we saw the hit of the foam to the orbiter, we relied on our experience that it had never really damaged the orbiter too badly before, and that subconsciously led us to the bad conclusion. But to actually blow the wing off, it would have had to have been a heck of a large piece, and that just wasn't the case.
There's another question actually about the debris. You had mentioned that it's at KSC. Is any of that available for the public to see, or?
We'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. We've got some things about that, so we'll be glad to talk about that.
Perfect.
Yeah. And there was one other question, and that was that when at this point and in your where you're at now, were you guys thinking that well, maybe this was more of a rescue mission, or did you really come to the conclusion that it was completely lost?
Well, we didn't know first whether it was lost or not. We once the orbiter did the deorbit burn to come home, it was invariably committed to a particular runway. It really couldn't go anywhere else. We could change ends of the runway that we landed on, but we couldn't go to any other runway in the States. And so when the orbiter wasn't there, we knew we were in big trouble. We just didn't know how bad. You know, down in our souls, you know, I knew it was lost, and it was not going to be a good day. But it was about 30 minutes after it didn't come home that we first saw the trails on CNN. We went up to my office and turned on the TV, and we saw the accident happening on replay on TV, and then that's when it really hit home.
I guess there was some confusion. There was a website that came up that was called spaceflightnow.com at the time, stating that something that there was a rescue. I think that there was also some public confusion there with, I don't know if you guys knew anything about that or.
About the rescue potential?
Yeah.
Yeah, after, let's see, John, do you want to wait on that one, or do you want to?
Yeah, I guess given the point where they figured out, where they started seeing the orbiter breaking up, when those films started coming in of it breaking up over Dallas, it was 200,000 feet up in the air and was traveling 12,000 miles an hour, and there was nothing that could have, there was no way they could have survived that. Even if the crew module had stayed intact, they were still not going to survive that kind of fall. So I think it quickly became that it was not going to be a rescue mission, but it was going to become a recovery operation.
Thanks so much. Yeah, great.
All right. So Mike has talked about the silence at Kennedy Space Center as being, you know, one of the experiences that he felt, and meanwhile, while these folks at Kennedy were standing here in silence and waiting, this was what was going on in East Texas.
What's the location of your emergency?
I can barely hear you. My name is Hubbard Hill.
Okay, what's the emergency?
It appears that we have had an explosion in this area.
An explosion?
That's what it sounds like.
Okay, you don't know where it's coming from?
No, ma'am. It is rocking the area.
You know, I just asked what that noise was myself.
We're on West Hill, or is something blowing up? I don't know. Hold on 1 second. Hello? Hey. Y'all getting calls about this flying object? About a flying object? Yeah, blowing up. No, we're getting calls about something blowing up. Okay, we have one that's thinking it's possibly a meteor. We've also heard it's plane. Okay. All right. Do you have any particular area? Hold on. What's the area, Jack? Exact location.
343 west.
I'm 343. Okay. Hold on 1 second. Hello?
Crystal?
Yes.
This is Carrie. What's this going on?
I don't. Hold on, Carrie. Can I get a police department? This is Crystal.
What's going on?
Hold on 1 second.
Be advised, airport said it was 2 jets that flew over, broke the sound barrier.
911, what's the exact address of your emergency?
broke the sound barrier.
I'm finna say, while I'm standing out here, something fell out of the sky.
When?
Look like a little piece of metal.
Do you see it now? Do you have it?
Yeah, it's laying in the yard. It fell out of it's just a little bit of piece of metal. Look like a little piece of metal.
When did it fall out of the sky?
Yeah, it's a pine tree here.
When did it fall out?
Just now.
Okay, you're telling me a piece of metal fell out of the sky?
I'm gonna go over here and pick it up.
Okay, hold on just a minute. Don't do that.
Oh,
Hold on a
pick it
minute.
up? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
He said, don't pick it up.
So that's what was going on. There was, starting at just after 8 o'clock local time in East Texas, they heard a series of what was essentially thousands of sonic booms going on in sequence as Columbia broke up into smaller and smaller pieces as it passed overhead. So Mike and I referred to this as parallel confusion. The folks in Kennedy didn't know where Columbia was, and the people in East Texas didn't know what was happening around them. Most of the people in East Texas had no idea that the space shuttle was flying over that day. And so you had this interesting dichotomy between the Columbia just simply not being there, and the people in East Texas hearing this very strange noise, and then pieces falling out of the sky immediately after the accident.
So what we're calling courage, compassion, and commitment, and landing day obviously became recovery day one. The loss of the vehicle was around 40 miles high, maybe a little bit less than that, 12,000 miles per hour. The local residents out there in East Texas, deep East Texas, rural Texas, were just outstanding, and they were truly the first responders. The local sheriffs and just people finding debris in their backyards and their pastures. They were just outstanding during the whole event. They treated every piece of debris like it was sacred, and helped us protect the astronauts, and were just tremendous during the whole thing. We established our top three priorities with FEMA in a meeting that we held about an hour after the accident. Of course, public safety was number one. We didn't want to hurt anybody else. We had hypergolic fuels on board the ship, which are very toxic fuels for the thrusters. We had tanks that were still leaking, which we didn't know at the time, but came to find out later. We had fuel tanks that still had some fuel in them. They were leaking, and the poisonous gas was getting out. We had pyrotechnic devices. We weren't sure whether they were all expended or not. So public safety was our number one priority. Find our astronauts was right behind that as number two. And then, of course, look for the debris itself, because we needed to find the debris to figure out what happened to the ship so we could fix it and be able to fly the shuttle again.
You know, this is a picture of the overall initial search area. This is where debris was coming down from just south of Dallas to just into the area of Louisiana, just south of Fort Polk. And there were pieces of the shuttle coming down all along this area here. And just within several hours after the accidents, the first of the astronauts was found in the small area near Hemp Hill that's shown on this chart here. And that's when the local law enforcement really started helping out. As soon as somebody reported seeing human remains, then they certainly went into very high gear to start trying to take care of the situation. But it was an incredible miracle. This is the kind of stuff that people were finding in their yards and along the streets. Everything from, as Mike's saying, pieces smaller than a cell phone to this piece in the lower left here, which is part of the tunnel that led from the space shuttle back into the Space Hab module. And here's one of the fuel tanks that Mike was talking about, just landed in these people's backyard. It was a tremendous stroke of good luck that this happened on a Saturday morning when people were at home. There was one piece that fell through the roof in a schoolhouse, but there was nobody at school that day. Nobody on the ground got hurt, and there was no major structural damage, which was, for those who believe in miracles, that was certainly a miraculous kind of thing to happen. The NTSB told Mike the day that he showed up out in, when he went out to Barksdale Air Force Base to set up his command center, that to expect maybe 1% to 2% of the shuttle would hit the ground, and it became very apparent even within the first day that much more of the shuttle came to the ground than just 1 or 2%.
And another piece of good luck, if that's an appropriate way of putting it, is, Jonathan, if you could go back to slide 11 that shows the debris zone, if this accident had occurred 1 minute earlier, then these pieces of debris would have been in suburban Dallas as opposed to deep rural East Texas, where very sparsely populated, and so, you know, no telling what would have happened if the shuttle had come down in Dallas, for God's sakes.
Well, and the other thing too is if the shuttle had been cleared to land at Edwards instead of at Kennedy, the breakup would have happened out over the Pacific Ocean, and we might never have found any of Columbia.
Right.
Yeah. So this is I'm going to the picture of the mud puddle here. Like this is from, I believe, from Louisiana, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So there was, people were driving around, this is the far east end of the debris zone, and somebody noticed this mud puddle and drove past it and didn't think anything of it, and then they saw that there was mud splashed about 30 feet high in the trees next to it. And in excavating down to see what was in there, this is one of Columbia's power heads. This is part of the 6 parts of the 6 power heads that are on the main engines.
Yeah, we have a question from the audience. Did any of the fuel tanks have remaining fuel in them?
Yes, some of them did have residual fuel in them, and when we got to them on the ground, we let them vent off. There were no fuel tanks fully intact or full of fuel. They were all ruptured to some extent, but some had some residual fuels in them.
The EPA was a major part of this this operation. You know, one of the first things that NASA did when the public was told about the accident that afternoon, everybody was told, don't touch any piece of debris because you don't know if it's contaminated with things. And certainly many pieces of this were contaminated with hypergolic fuel. And we've seen pictures of EPA people taking some of the tanks off to let them vent. And you know, again, very fortunate that nobody got exposed to anything. With this power head here, this thing weighs hundreds of pounds, and it being a heavy type of object, it flew the farthest. Some of the pieces of the shuttle floated down almost like paper as soon as they encountered any air resistance, but the engines continued flying at supersonic speed. They hit the ground at about Mach 2 when they impacted near Fort Polk. They dug themselves tens of feet deep into the mud, and they found 3 of the power heads, and 3 of them are still out there somewhere. This is a picture of what the recovery looked like in the area near Hemp Hill, Texas, when the volunteers started taking over and searching for remains of the crew. You know, one of the really fortunate aspects of this happening in Texas was that the county judges had just gone through the previous summer, had just gone through disaster management preparation training and working with the incident command system to help get their local police offices and volunteer fire departments and things like that to work together and get trained in emergency management situations. So the people were very well trained actually to start taking over. And in this part of Sabine County, Texas, more than half of the residents work for the Forest Service. And so they knew the forests very, very well and were instrumental in being able to find ways to get back into very deep and dense brush.
One of the questions that we've got from chat is that has any debris been found of late? Any lately, or anything far after the fact?
Yes, as a matter of fact, we found pieces ever since the accident. At one point in time, about 4 years after the accident, Texas experienced a drought, and in the bottom of a dried up pond in the fellow's back pasture was one of our fuel tanks that was previously underwater that we didn't find. And then here, just about 2 years ago, we found a tile. There was a deer hunter out, scoping out his area to set up his stand, and saw this object, didn't know what it was. and use the process we set up out there to call the local authorities, and then they get in touch with NASA, and we send if it sounds like a probable piece of the shuttle, we'll send an engineer out to Texas to verify whether it was shuttle or not, and this particular one was. So about 2 years ago, another tile showed up. We will probably continue to find debris for years. It'll tail off. It already has tailed off. You know, we found pieces of Challenger wash up on the shore of Florida after that accident for many years after the accident too.
One of the picture we're showing now is at the volunteer fire department at Hemphill, Texas. And Hemphill was a town of about 1,100 people, a real small place that basically is there for the timber industry, and then there's for fishing on the reservoir there. But the size of the town more than tripled overnight after the accident because it became ground zero for the search for the crew. And literally thousands of searchers showed up. And there are very few places in town to stay, very few restaurants or anything. And the VFW commander asked his wife to start coordinating a food service operation. And so she got on the phone and pretty soon had hundreds of local women bringing in food and things like that. And eventually a totally voluntary feeding operation just done by the local populace ended up serving between 30 and 40,000 meals at no cost to the government, to the searchers. And this was for the 2 weeks that it took to find the crew. So it was amazing. When we talk about the good people of East Texas, these are people who really knew how to treat folks right, to help support people in a time of need. You know, the NASA folks were showing up to try to search for some of their friends and colleagues and had no places to stay. People were going to sleep in their cars, and local residents just said, wait a minute, I've got an extra bedroom, come over, you're staying at my place now, and things like that. And so it just became a tremendous outpouring of support for the NASA community. So the search area narrowed down as we got better and better information about where critical pieces of the crew compartment were coming down. We knew to start concentrating the search for the crew in a certain area, and they were all found in this area near Hemphill, Texas, and all returned to their families for burial. It was again one of the major miracles of this operation. You know, not thinking that anything was not thinking that anything was going to survive falling from that distance at that speed to being able to actually find the astronauts and bring them back home again was a major victory, and a very emotional victory, and a very important victory for the people there in town.
I actually saved a radar image from that day. I actually have the radar debris over that area you were just talking about.
Yeah.
It's
one of the the gentleman that led the ground search in Hemphill, that was how he knew where to start looking, was the very same thing. He took the radar image off the screenshot of the weather service picture that day and used that as his initial search grid.
Yeah.
So picking up the pieces after the crew was found, NASA really didn't want to continue to put volunteers in harm's way, because this was hazardous operations, working out in cold and wet and mud and briars. It was really not a very safe place for volunteers to be, and it was not a sustainable thing to continue to try to search for the rest of the shuttle. As Mike said, that there was a mandate to try to recover as much of the shuttle as possible so that they could reconstruct the cause of the accident. And someone from the Texas Forest Service suggested that the wildland firefighters from the National Forest Service be brought in, because they're already trained in how to do grid searches, and so they were trained how to walk grids and look for bits and pieces of the shuttle on the ground, what to look for and how to treat it. And so you had 4 camps that were set up along that debris corridor, each of which had 1,000 people staying at it, and every 2 weeks they were rotated out. That's how we got to the 25,000 people who were involved eventually here. But you had thousands of people literally on the ground every day for 3 months out there searching 680,000 acres by foot. You had about 38 helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft out there searching the area beside the footprint, the area that was being searched on foot, and somewhere around 1.5 million man-hours. And you also had the Navy doing dives in the lakes and the ponds out there to look for pieces of the shuttle.
One way to think about how big an area that was, I always like to mention is we walked on foot an area 120 miles long and 10 miles wide. And so folks, think of a town that's 120 miles from your hometown, whatever that may be. For me, it's Jacksonville, but 120 miles from your hometown, and then perpendicular to that line, something 10 miles off of that center line, and just mentally draw that huge rectangle, and that's the size of the area of Texas that we walked on foot, about 6 feet apart, and looking down on the ground for debris, looking up in trees for debris, through streams and ponds, etc., and just a tremendous effort. And that's here again, as Jonathan said, that's why it took so many people, and those wildland firefighters were just tremendous during the operation.
So as we mentioned, all the astronauts were found and returned. We'll talk about the 2 air searchers who were killed. Again, no one on the ground injured as a result of this, of the debris falling. This statement, "Their mission became our mission," became kind of the motto of the folks in East Texas because of their identification with their mission being the Columbia crew. It became our mission to bring them back home again and to bring closure to what they did. And so the end result was about 38% of the orbiter by dry weight was recovered, about 84,000 pieces weighing a little over 20 or almost 23 tons. And that was 10 times all the previous reentry debris from uncontrolled reentries that had ever been recovered. So this was, as Mike will tell you a little later on, this was a tremendously valuable material from a scientific and engineering standpoint as well.
And that's 10 times all debris from all spacefaring nations in the history of spaceflight. All debris that ever made it to the ground from space, Columbia represented 10 times that. And here again, that started to inform us that we had a particular opportunity to do something with Columbia that hadn't been done before.
One other question, if I can just interject. One other question that came out over the chat was, typically in a recovery operation, you run over other accidents that weren't related. Did you guys experience or run into any other accidents, lost aircraft or whatever that weren't related to the crash?
It's my understanding that they found some bodies from some disappeared people, and they came across many meth labs, from what I understand as well.
Oh. And we found a couple of stills too out in the woods, but.
Report those,
Generally, most people, this is an area of the country where people are not necessarily the most welcoming of the federal government, but I think they understood the importance of the search for Columbia, and most people were very gracious about letting the searchers come on their land and search. And if somebody had a concern and didn't want federal people on their land, they were instructed as to how to go about looking for things and to report back if they did find something. Just wanted to show this one picture. This is one of the tent cities that was set up. This one is in the Nacogdoches arena. And there were 10 cities like this in 4 different towns along the recovery area. One of the things that I thought was most fascinating about this was that a lot of the wildland firefighters that were brought in were Native Americans. And so we ended up with a lot of Native Americans who were searching for this. And it was very interesting hearing stories about how they reacted to the debris because of some of their beliefs that even inanimate objects can hold the spirit of people who've been interacting with them before. So they treated the debris with great reverence and respect, and they were all very deeply emotionally touched by the work that they did with this, and it was profoundly moving to the NASA folks to be working with them.
just a couple points to make there. The Native Americans came from many different tribes and from tribes that normally didn't interact, but here they were sleeping in their little pup tents next to each other, and every night the different tribes would go into their chants and they would share stories about the history of their tribes and their beliefs and trade little trinkets and whatnot. And we had one astronaut in the astronaut corps, John Harrington, who is Native American, and he spent a lot of time out there with them, and he was just tremendously moved by this show of support from the Native Americans. And without them, we never could have done what we did by retrieving as much debris.
This is a helicopter crew, typical of one of the search operations. The Forest Service had contracted with this gentleman in the dark or the black jacket here. His name was Buzz Meyer. He was a Vietnam veteran. He was a helicopter pilot that did tours in the Grand Canyon, and he had volunteered to help out with the search. And so you have with him two gentlemen from Kennedy Space Center with the hats with the white writing on them. The gentleman in the yellow jacket at the far end is Charles Krennick from the Texas Forest Service. They're stopped here to refuel and have lunch. And after they got back in their helicopter later that day, they were flying just above the treetops when the fuel pump gave out on the helicopter, and there was no opportunity for them to recover. They nosed in, and the pilot, Buzz Meyer, and Charles Krennick, the Texas Forest Service gentleman, were both killed instantly upon impact. The other three passengers in the back there sustained severe injuries, but they were able to walk away from the accident, and they all survived. But this was, when you talk to people in Texas about the loss of life of Columbia, they always make sure to include these two people from the search crew. And this, again, the loss of Charles Krennick, who was a very popular fellow in East Texas. He was a native son for them, and to lose him as part of the search for Columbia was really part of that. Their mission became our mission sentimentality, and so it's really important that we remember that there are people who sacrificed their lives in the search for Columbia. This was the Navy operations out on this was on one of the reservoirs out there. The Navy did more than 3,000 dives and spent more than 800 hours on the bottom of the lakes and rivers out there looking for debris, and unfortunately did not find anything, even though they had tested out their radar to be able to look for things. The bottom here, these lakes, the biggest lake they were looking in had been flooded much faster than had been intended, and so they never had a chance to clear the trees and even some of the farm equipment out of the area that got flooded when this lake was originally built. So where the lake was originally constructed. So it became difficult to try to sort out returns from old rusted tractors, from other things that might have been bits and pieces of the shuttle. But to the best extent possible, we were pretty well convinced that nothing from the shuttle had been missed down there, even though people who were fishing out on the reservoir the day of the accident said they heard big things splashing in the water all around them, but nothing was ever really recovered from there. This is what a typical grid search looked like, and this was on an easy day for these folks where they're just walking in an open area here. But you can see they stand 6 to 10 feet apart from each other and scan the ground around them, looking for whatever they can find that doesn't look right. And they would cover, walk forward for a mile, pivot around, come back down the other direction, and eventually, with teams, with say maybe 50 of these types of teams out on the ground every day, you're covering a sizable portion of the land, and eventually, little by little, you covered that entire search grid.
We had a couple of more questions from chat.
Sure. Yeah.
Yes. So I know you mentioned the radar technology that was being used for the lake. Were there any other new technologies that were used to find pieces to make the search easier?
Well, we did. We tried practically every technology there was to look for debris. We got involved with some of our security friends, our national intelligence friends. They helped us out. So yeah, we were using everything we could. We even tried things like flying little drones, the precursors for what's today very, very commonplace drone, paragliders. Civil Air Patrol helped us out. We were doing thermal imaging from the sky. We were doing thermal imaging from far away. So we were. There was no technology that was suggested that we didn't try. Put it that way.
A second question that is kind of a throwback to earlier in the discussion. Maybe something we want to have to hold to the last, but in retrospect, could the shuttle wing have been patched in flight, or was the mission due from the start?
Well, we didn't have any repair capability in the shuttle program for tile damage or larger damage. As Jonathan said earlier, this particular mission, we did not have the capability to do a spacewalk because it was a science mission with that space lab in the payload bay of the shuttle. So we were not able to go outside of the shuttle, even if we'd had repair capability at that time. So no, in real time, even if we'd known that the shuttle was irreparably damaged, there was nothing we could have done about it. When we returned to flight, almost 3 years later, we had to demonstrate repair capability in space, and we did that along with a lot of other enhancements to the space shuttle program. But we did demonstrate the ability to repair tiles and fairly minor damage throughout the remainder of the shuttle program. Our ace in the hole for the remainder of the shuttle program was we always had to have a second shuttle standing by to fly within about 2 months to go rescue astronauts, because if you think about it, all but one mission after Columbia went to the International Space Station, and so if we had damaged the shuttle, say Atlantis, if we damaged Atlantis like we did Columbia and made it to the space station, well, the astronauts could hang out up there for a couple of months, no problem. But then we would send up another shuttle to bring them home. So we always had to have the capability of a rescue mission after the Columbia accident, which we never had before.
Any other questions come through?
And I'll try to hold any further questions till the end.
Okay.
Thanks.
We're going to talk a little bit now about the reconstruction, which revealed the cause of the accident, and then talk about how the efforts that Mike took to preserve and help us learn from Columbia, and then how we went about coming to closure on this, and then what the ultimate effect was for the shuttle program. So here we are in the reconstruction hangar. Mike?
Yeah, this is a large hangar that's right next to the shuttle landing facility, the runway the shuttle comes back on. What you're looking at, this is about 2 months into the 3-month recovery, so this is most of the debris. This is the belly of the Space Shuttle Columbia. Right in the center, maybe a third of the way back, you see 2 tires. That's the nose landing gear, the 2 tires of the nose gear. So it's the belly of the shuttle inside this hangar, flipped upside down, so it's belly side up with the nose closest to us in that picture. And obviously you see some large pieces. I mentioned earlier most of the pieces were very small, and that's true, and they were all just stored in boxes along the sidewall, or along the walls of this hangar. But anything that had to do with the belly of the orbiter that would help us solve the mystery, solve what caused the accident, we put out on the grid, and then we were able to study it, much more closely.
The people who were doing this work were for the vast majority, were people from Kennedy Space Center who had worked on Columbia, and so who knew the systems very, very well already.
Yeah, we lobbied right after the accident. There was a decision to be made about where to do the reconstruction, and we lobbied to do it back here because we did. We knew the ship better than anybody else, and so that's why I was sent back here for reconstruction. The next picture is what we call a tile table. It looks, it's the shape of the wing of the orbiter, and again, belly side up. And these are tiles that were recovered and then placed in their proper location on the wing. And so you see a few tiles. Most of the tiles, we didn't get back most of the tiles. That rectangular kind of empty area right in the middle, that's where a landing gear door is. And that landing gear door is stored elsewhere, or on display elsewhere in the reconstruction hangar. But this allowed us to get up close and personal to the tiles themselves and study the heat patterns on the tiles, and really enabled us to pinpoint where the breach in the thermal protection system started.
One of the things we learned from, as each piece was picked up, it was tagged with its GPS coordinates. And so as the pieces went back to Kennedy Space Center for identification, it started to tell a story very clearly here. And you can see with this one thing here, looking at the pins that are in red are pieces from the left wing, and pieces in blue or the pins in blue are pieces from the right wing. And so you can see that it was very clear that the left wing failed first. The shuttle was traveling from upper left in this picture to lower right. And so the pieces of the left wing were hitting the ground much earlier than the pieces of the right wing. So the left wing obviously had failed first. And this is part of using the debris to be able to tell the story. And it was also finding pieces, for example, of things that were in the crew module that helped pinpoint the search for the orbiter experiment box, which we'll talk about in a few minutes here.
This is one of our engineers. This is Lyle Davis, piecing together bits and pieces of the leading edge of the wing of the space shuttle. It's made out of a material called reinforced carbon-carbon. It's kind of a fancy fiberglass, very good thermally. It's brittle, breaks not very easily, but it's brittle. And he's putting, like a jigsaw puzzle, he's putting small pieces back together to try to get a larger piece of placement on the ship.
One of the things that's amazing to me is you see these little tiny pieces of the RCC in front of him here. Again, each of these things was found somewhere on the ground out in East Texas, somewhere out in the woods or in the forests or the grasslands or something. But people have found each of these individual pieces, bagged them, and sent them back to Kennedy Space Center. It was just an amazing recovery. Next slide, Mike.
Well, let's see. That's yours truly. We wanted to display the reinforced carbon-carbon leading edge of the wing in a manner where you could see the outside and the inside at the same time. And so we built these Lexan Lexan displays, and then pieced together in the proper location, obviously, where the pieces of reinforced carbon-carbon went. And we did this for all 22 panels of the left wing, and what it told us was that around panels 9 and 10, there was very, very little debris left as you went towards panels 1 through 9, which is kind of from the body of the shuttle outboard, 1 through 9. As you're going towards the main part of the shuttle, we were picking up more and more debris. Likewise, outboard of the wing, on the edge of the wing, we were finding large pieces of reinforced carbon-carbon, and so it zeroed in the fact that the failure occurred around panels 9 or 10, which is right where the wing kind of comes up, takes a big bend off the shuttle itself, and so this allowed us to see the insides and the outsides. We were able to take samples of the slag, the molten material, the melted material, and section that and see which material melted first, second, and third and got laid down and inside the wing before the failure. So these panels helped us quite a bit in studying where the actual first damage was.
It's a tremendous forensics exercise that was done to be able to tell that story in real time just by analyzing the bits and pieces of debris. It was just fascinating for me to learn about that.
I always tell people if you could separate out the emotion of what happened, this was a fascinating engineering study. The problem is you couldn't separate out the emotion. That was the problem.
The holy grail that they were looking for in this was the orbiter experiments package, a data recorder, which is kind of like the black box that airlines have. Columbia was the only one that was outfitted with this because it was the first orbiter that flew in space, and so it was heavily instrumented with strain gauges and temperature sensors and other types of devices that fed into a recorder. And so NASA was hoping that they might be able to find this orbiter experiments recorder box somewhere that would help to piece together what happened. Because if you go back and listen to the tapes of the accident too, when the voice communication cut out with Houston, there was a gap of about 30 seconds, and then there was a very brief blip of data. So something was going on with Columbia for about 30 seconds. But there wasn't enough data back on the ground to be able to figure what that was. And so if we could figure out, if we could find this recorder assembly, would help to piece it together. And so it was located in St. Augustine area of Texas. And miraculously, you can see how good a shape it's in here. You can still read the property tag on there, and the tape inside of it was intact. It had broken right after the shuttle broke up, but it told the story of the breakup as well, of what was going on with the sensors inside the ship.
Yeah, this is an old magnetic tape recorder.
When we talk about a miraculous recovery, you see how good a shape this is in. Here are some of the boxes that were in the avionics area near that. And you can see how badly beat up and charred and melted and burned and twisted those were. So it really was amazing that they said that the MAS recorder was just sitting on a little mound, like somebody had just kind of walked over and put it down there. It was just incredible to find it in that kind of shape. So after the recovery reconstruction was over, then it became time to figure out what to do with Columbia. And as Mike mentioned, Challenger did not get a very ceremonial treatment. It's buried in 2 Minuteman missile silos in a basically very far out of the way area out on Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. Mike, maybe tell us a little bit about what you want to do with Columbia.
Well, like we said earlier, we had 10 times the amount of debris from all other entering spacecraft in the history of spaceflight, and so we knew we had a real treasure trove of information and material. You know, we had aluminum and glass and paper and clothing and titanium and tile, and we had all this different material that was subjected to the heat and forces of re-entry. So we had materials that went through that. We had structures that went through that experienced different loads on the structures, and so we came up with the idea of lending out the debris. Studying the debris first rather than just bury it like Challenger. I remember presenting the idea to the administrator, and he liked it, and so we ran with it. We created a Columbia Debris Loan Program, still very active today, where institutions or academia can apply to get a piece of Columbia from NASA to study. A lot of material science is going on, a lot of structural analysis. The new seats and Boeing spacecraft that's going to fly astronauts here shortly was designed in part to based on the failure of the seats in Columbia, that type of thing. So we wanted to design better and safer spacecraft based on what happened to Columbia, how it reacted during re-entry. Still a very active program, and I'm proud to say there are 3 people in the States that have their PhDs based on studying Columbia. So a very, very successful program. This individual is Mike Cianelli in front of the stainless steel doors. And behind those doors is where Columbia is stored. Every piece is located. We can get to any piece within about 20 minutes. And so here again, unlike Challenger that's buried piece on top of another down in 120-foot deep Minuteman missile silos, never to be seen again, Columbia is informing, it's teaching, it's really continuing our mission to a very, very real extent. And Mike is he's the curator of the Columbia Room and the Debris Loan Program.
it's not open to the general public, but NASA strongly recommends that everybody who comes to work at Kennedy Space Center go through the Columbia room, because they want people to understand the consequences of decisions that you make. Everybody that makes a decision one way or another has potential impact on the safety of the crew or the safety of the ship. And so it's there's nothing that can bring that message home more impactfully than actually going through the Columbia Preservation Area. And so these are some of the things that are on display here. To the left is what's left of the airlock and the tunnel to the Space Hab module, and you can see bits and pieces of thrusters on there. This is the side view of the tunnel. Again, most of the heavy stuff came down, but the lighter aluminum material just evaporated. But the bulk of Columbia is stored in these boxes. As Mike mentioned, most of it was very small, and it's all individually labeled and indexed, and within any piece that somebody could request can be located and retrieved within a couple of hours from this area. The question came up earlier about the tile that was found. Here is one of the tile that was found recently, most recently in East Texas. Still in relatively decent shape. Let's talk a little bit about the, we've talked a little bit about the legacy of Columbia here, and Mike Cinelli, both through the Debris Program and the Forever Remembered Program, is helping to continue to educate NASA and the public about the continuing hazards of spaceflight and what we can do to try to avoid failures, both mechanical and equipment and human failures that lead to accidents like this. And the dangers of complacency, as Mike mentioned too. Getting used to things happening, just because we've gotten away with it in the past doesn't mean we're going to continue to get away with it in the future. And the question,
about the debris. This is at the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex in the Atlantis building. Any of y'all have ever been to the Atlantis building, you've probably seen this. It's called Forever Remembered, and it's a tribute to the 14 astronauts that died in the space shuttle program. And it has on display these pieces. On the left there with the American flag, that's a piece of Challenger that we recovered off the floor of the ocean. It was actually twice that size. Had to cut it in half to get it down in a missile silo. And on the right are the window frames from Columbia. And so visitors to the Space Center Visitor Complex can see these pieces of debris, and before you get to these pieces of debris in the back of the display are tributes to all 14 astronauts and their individual cases of mementos that their families have lent to NASA to put on display with the idea of trying to get to know the astronauts a little bit better, the ones that gave their lives for the nation and the world. And the key point is that these are real people. They're astronauts, they're heroes, yeah, all that stuff. But these are real people. They got kids and families and mortgages and so these are people that put their lives on the line for the betterment of the world. And but they're real people, and that's the point that we like to get across when we talk about them in the Forever Remembered display at the Visitor Center.
Very, very strongly recommend you get there, and when you get there, to make sure that you spend some time there, because it's a very powerful and very moving display. Mike Cinelli has done a tremendous job in working with the families to enable NASA to be able to display this for the public. I think it's very important to see that it's very tastefully done as well. The debris line program. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've already kind of talked to all this stuff.
Okay. All right. Well, and then we end up with a shameless plug for the book, but we're deeply gratified that it's gotten such a great reception. Mike and I started working on it about 5 years ago, and it's been in print for 2 years now. It just came out in paperback in January, and it's also in recorded books, and it's on electronic book format as well. But if you're interested in a signed copy, bringincolumbiahome.com. Mike and I would be happy to personalize a copy for you as well. But we'll be happy to take questions.
Yeah, so Steve, I don't know if you can unmute people, but while you're doing that, I'll get to ask the first question. So, definitely, more probably towards Mike, but thinking about when this happened in 2003, what was going on in our society, with, we had just experienced the, attacks on 9/11, and you mentioned that in the book, but could you, maybe expand a little bit upon, what those feelings were, what those, was there a sense of dread that this wasn't maybe just an accident, but maybe more?
Well, at first, yes, there was, and one of the things we do in NASA, and a lot of organizations do it. You put together the fault tree of what could have led to the situation, whatever it may be, and one of the potentials was terrorism, and so we had to clear that it was not terrorism. We had FBI come in and take samples of the debris, make sure there were no explosives on the debris. But yeah, we had to prove that it wasn't terrorism, although no one really believed it was, because it came apart at 40 miles high, and it would have had to have been a very, very sophisticated plant of some sort of a device, but we had to prove it, and so yeah, we went down that path, and I remember when I had the FBI in the hangar, we didn't want to talk about it to the team because we were still very emotional about the thing, so I didn't want them thinking about the potential for terrorism, so we never even told the team at the time that FBI was swabbing the debris for explosives. We just treated them like other engineers doing their work, and then later, we came to grips with it and told everybody what was going on. But it was yes, with Elon Ramon on board, we had extraordinary security on launch day, more security on launch for this shuttle mission than any other mission in history, and so the thought of terrorism was in our minds from months before the accident, months before the mission, all the way through the accident. Yes.
Thank you.
And Mike, you even said at one point they were considering launching a day early, unannounced, just to forestall a potential terrorist attack too, I think.
Yeah, that was that was Operation Yankees, what we called it, and yeah, we put together a plan where we could have launched a day early just in case there was a planned attack on the shuttle on launch day. At least it would have thrown them off and made them accelerate their planning, and so we presented that all the way up the chain in Washington D.C., and it got turned down because we concluded that NASA is a civilian agency, and we ought not act like a military agency, and we ought to trust our processes or security on launch day and go with it, and that's what we did. So, but yeah, we were worried about security from months leading up to the mission.
We have two questions from chat. One is, after with what you did with Columbia's debris and everything, was there any discussion in resurrecting the Challenger debris and doing something similar?
No is the answer. And I get this question every now and then, but why did we react so differently with the debris from Columbia versus Challenger? And it's just there's a different mood in the agency. And Challenger was back, it was the 25th flight of the space shuttle, and the space shuttle was supposed to be very routine, very safe. We were going to launch a shuttle every 2 weeks. And so back then, the managers and leadership concluded that that accident was one of a kind, that'll never happen again, and let's just put it behind us and move on. And so the decision was to get rid of the debris, put it in the ground, and put a concrete cap over it. Don't ever see it again. That was a decision they made. I don't agree with it, but it was right for the agency at the time, and so there was talk. There was just a tiny bit of talk about bringing out more of the debris of Challenger and put it on display. This one piece is how it ended up. Shortly after this Forever Remembered display in the visitor center came about, was the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 1 fire. If you recall the Apollo fire on the launch pad, and the families of the 3 astronauts that died in that fire were against any kind of public display of the fire or the debris or anything like that. But given the Forever Remembered display, then the families of the Apollo astronauts got comfortable with displaying the hatches from Apollo 1 spacecraft. And those hatches that were involved in the fire of Apollo 1, they are on display in the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex as well. The same, they're out in the Apollo Saturn V building. So it took the families of the Apollo 1 astronauts 50 years to get comfortable with displaying that debris.
One thing I'd like to point out, with Challenger is that the big difference between Challenger and Columbia was that Challenger exploded in the atmosphere, or actually it broke up in the atmosphere. It was not a hypersonic reentry. Columbia was a hypersonic reentry, at Mach 12 or more, 12,000 miles an hour, 200 miles up. It was, 200,000 feet up. It was subject to the effects of plasma and all kinds of things like that. So there was a lot more scientifically to learn from Columbia's debris than there was from Challenger's debris. With Challenger, once they learned the cause of the accident, there was really no scientific or engineering need to keep that accessible, with the exception of one time. I think they did go down into Challenger to look at the cracks to see if the flow liners in the engine compartments had cracks when they were finding those in other shuttles. But that was the only time they ever really went down to study anything from Challenger.
And another question, it says, Google Maps shows that there's a Patricia Huffman Smith NASA museum. Is that a private museum or a NASA sponsored? And do you know what they have at that museum? Have you heard of it?
Yeah, it's a private museum. It's helped. NASA has helped put material in there. It's run by actually the lady that ran the food service operation at the VFW hall runs that museum now. She and a friend of hers from the National Parks or from the Forest Service and some other folks felt that they wanted to make sure that the memory of both Columbia and the people who helped out in that search wanted to make sure that was preserved. So they started this museum there. They worked very hard, got NASA's cooperation. They have actually better mementos from the crew than the Forever Remembered exhibit has. And Mike and I were very fortunate to be able to go to the museum on the 15th anniversary of the accident, and we got a chance to thank the people personally there at that point.
Thank you.
If you're ever in East Texas, yeah, definitely stop by there. It's a great museum.
Question about the orbiter Columbia specifically. You all mentioned in the book, because it was the first, it was definitely heavier. And you also, and I don't know if it was in the foreword or when, but illustrate how attached people were specifically to that orbiter, because it was so much harder to process or more difficult to process. But when was there any thought that had it been another orbiter, one of the later orbiters that potentially, with the weight savings, maybe ditching the experiments, would that weight savings could have made, or would it have made any difference in the end result of the accident?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. And, the basic answer is no. We studied, after the accident, we studied if we could have ejected the Space Hab module out of the payload bay, which we could not, by the way, but had we been able to do that to save that weight and therefore hopefully lessen the loads on the vehicle during reentry, would that have been enough of a savings in weight to lessen the damage, the burning damage? And the bottom line is that, you're going from Mach 25 through the atmosphere to land within an hour, and so that heating difference is so slight compared to how hot it gets that there's really nothing that could have been done. We looked at changing the trajectory of the reentry profile to a more cool profile, so to speak. But nothing would have saved it, and nothing would, and the lighter orbiters. That's an interesting point. But still, here again, that amount of weight difference would not have made any difference in the heating enough to save the vehicle. So had we known how bad the damage was, we would have known it was doomed.
Thank you. But we've gotten lots of comments also from the chat, just thanking you both, Jonathan and Mike, for the presentation, and one call out from Ann Setterquist, just thanking you for your thorough but sensitive writing as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So,
it's our pleasure. We always enjoy getting the opportunity to talk about this.
You've gotten a lot of fantastic remarks here in the chat, and I'll make sure I take a copy of it, and I'll email you both with some of that. So thank you.
Thanks for the invitation.
Appreciate it.